It has never been easy to share my feelings. Under my trauma and pain, I became silent. I hid myself and my story behind me for a long time. But something in my heart encouraged me to draw about every moment of what happened to me. So I let the pencil guide me, and in time, I gave pieces of me into my art. Hiding is over.
Welcome, everyone, to Becoming Joshua, our grand opening of the art exhibit and the Prelude book talk and reading. Glad to see everyone here today. It's a beautiful day in Lansing, Michigan. We have a wonderful program planned for you, not only here in our Gannon, Michigan room, but then over at TLC directly after this time. So we'll jump right in, and I would like to just do a quick overview of the day that we have for you. First, what we're going to have is Dr. Tanya Bailey. She's our Chief Diversity Officer. Then our author, Tammy Vaughn, author of the Becoming Joshua, His First Two Lives. She will do a book talk and reading, and then followed by question and answer time. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please let us know. We'll be gathering those. After that, we will then conclude. We'll move over to the TLC building for the art exhibit grand opening, ribbon cutting and reception. So welcome, and Dr. Bailey would like to join me. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oh, we can do better than that. Good afternoon. I wore yellow because it was so sunny today, and you know, in Michigan, that's a plus, because we never know what we're going to get. I am most humbled and excited all at the same time to be here today. I want to share just a couple of words about the word becoming. Can everybody just say that with me? Becoming. One more time. Becoming. The title of this book is Becoming Joshua, His Two Lives. And when I looked up the word becoming, by definition, it means the process of coming to be of something. The process of coming to be of something. And when you look at the lives of Joshua and the stories that is found inside of this amazing piece of work, the becoming is so fitting. But it's not just becoming for Joshua. As you read the book, you start becoming for yourself. This story is one of millions of stories that reminds us of the struggle, of the oppression, and just the simple desire of every human to be free. So what is free? Freedom is not designed by one single person, system, or entity. Freedom, first, is a choice. Secondly, is a right. And so today, we are historically making a statement and sharing in an unforgettable time that documents someone's desire to know first that they are free, choosing to be their authentic self. And when you talk about being authentic and there's barriers and blockers or resistance to that, the struggle becomes even harder. Today, as we listen to the author and then visit this amazing exhibit, which, by the way, I will do a spoiler alert, I have seen it. Thank you, Joshua. And I can ask Cindy to attest that I barely could compose myself. As a person of color, a Black woman, I have my own story of oppression, not the same as Joshua and the millions of others, but I will promise you it will be life-changing. I instantly shared with Joshua that this is transformation. His story is transformative. You and I have the right to become. We have the right to be free. And today, I hope that you have a transformative experience the same way that I have. I am privileged to introduce our author. Now, I was told that Tammy is extremely mild and gentle. She does not like to have a lot of fanfare, so you know I'm not going to sing. She spoiled it. But I will say, as part of Lansing Community College, both Joshua and Tammy represent who we are. There's so many stories and so many journeys that walk these halls and walk our campuses that we have an opportunity and pretty much an obligation to get to hear and know those stories. And I'm thankful for you, Tammy Vaughn, who is an alumni of LCC. Yes, yes. 15 years of service and counting, because she's also a professional tutor in one of my favorite areas, the Learning Commons. One of the first areas that really welcomed me when I got to LCC. What I love about Tammy, which is true for many, many other staff and faculty and definitely students here, is that she has a passion to see people thrive. And not only a passion to see people thrive, but particularly those who have unique stories like Joshua, or those that struggle, and those that have come to our country not knowing or having English as their first language. I want to describe Tammy as a barrier breaker, because her writings and ability to see beyond just a student from another country, but to see the potential and that story and what it would mean if people like me and people like you had an opportunity to be exposed to it. So Tammy Vaughn is the author of Becoming Joshua, and because she don't like a whole lot of fanfare, I would ask that you just give her some snaps, which is the sign of appreciation when you're listening to literature and poetry. Can we practice? Please snap it up for our author today, Ms. Tammy Vaughn.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So first, I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Tanya Bailey for that kind introduction. Getting a little emotional. It was more than I ever expected. So thank you very much. And on behalf of Joshua and myself, I would like to thank everyone for being here with us at LCC today. And I'd also like to extend a special welcome to those joining us from around the country and around the world via WebEx. Some of you may be wondering why I'm here today and not Joshua. The short answer is because he asked me to be. But he didn't just ask me this week or this month. He asked me in 2019, soon after we started writing Becoming Joshua. At that point, I told him I didn't think I should, that it was his story, and that people needed to hear him tell it. Over the course of the hours spent together in discussion and hours spent writing, I began to get an inkling of the amount of loss, pain, and heartbreak that these pages would hold, and I agreed to speak at these events. I'm here today not just to share a part of Joshua's story, but also his art. Drawing was one of the constants in his life. From the time he was a very young boy in Iran, his favorite thing to draw was the cross, a symbol that he was only able to glimpse briefly as his family drove by the high walls of an Armenian church. He filled the margins of his notebooks and journals with it and even drew it on his skin each day. When I asked to know more about that, this is what Joshua told me. When I was 15, I decided I didn't want to be a Muslim anymore. Wrestling filled the place that religion had left. I'd won competitions all over Iran, but now I was preparing for my first international competition. I spent 7 to 10 hours a day in the gym to prepare. I studied the way my prospective opponents would approach matches. I trained harder than before, and I grew more aggressive. When I wasn't training or working out for myself, I coached friends who wanted to learn more about wrestling and fighting. Mentally, I wasn't as focused as I could have been. Even though I had left my faith behind, I still prayed for my success, though it wasn't a prayer in the way that I had known before. It was more of a wish sent out to someone or something in the universe. I lost the final match of the international competition in overtime. I changed the focus of my training for more endurance, and I believed, arrogantly, that the next time I competed at that level, I would come in first. I made sure everyone knew that's what I thought. When I wasn't in the gym, I drew. My pencil moved with more confidence now, and the images I produced were becoming more complex, but the cross was still my favorite thing to draw. One day, my friend Reza and I were sitting in the shade of one of the pomegranate trees in my yard, perfecting indolence in the way that only teenagers can. "Why do you do that?" Reza asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. My head had been resting back against the trunk of the tree. I opened my eyes to look at him. "Do what?" "That," he pointed at my arm. I looked at the cross I had drawn on my forearm. No one had ever asked me why before. I traced the lines with my fingers. "I don't know. I just like how it looks." "You should put it there permanently," he said. "Save you the trouble of drawing it every day." I looked at him. How would I do that? Even permanent marker washes off eventually. He picked up a leaf and tore it along the veins to the central spine. "My uncle does tattoos. It's not that hard. I could show you how to do it." I thought he was joking, but no nascent humor twitched at the corners of his lips. Getting a tattoo was against everything I'd been taught, everything I believed for so many years. I looked down at my arm again, and I knew that none of that mattered. I wanted to be able to look down and see the cross I'd drawn. I wanted to know it was a part of me, even when I couldn't see it. I looked up at him again. "When?" I asked. I would have done it that day in the yard, but it was going to take more planning than that. At my house or Reza's house, there was no privacy. Even if we managed to find a few minutes of quiet, we were sure to be interrupted before we finished. I called my cousin, Vahid. "You want to do what?" he said. I glanced around to see if I was still alone. "A tattoo. Reza learned how from his uncle." "Come here," he said. "I'll watch, but I have to see this for myself." Over the next few days, I drew different versions of the design and tried them out on my arm. I refined the lines, I added flourishes and curves that scrolled in complex patterns. Each time, I imagined the new design as a permanent part of me. None of them were right. I went back to the simpler version I've been drawing for years and added a book to the base. It had been several days since our conversation in the shady part of my yard, but Reza and I set off for the older part of the city. I was more determined than ever to go through with it. Arima had been occupied for more than 1,000 years, creating places where a person could step back into history. Our neighborhood was laid out in neat blocks on a predictable grid. Only a few miles away, the city changed. The streets were narrow and twisted at eccentric angles. Houses huddled together and eventually melded into covered alleyways that were only wide enough to allow a single person on foot to pass. The patchwork of passageways was a remnant from a time when invaders were mounted on horseback, but the maze was still in use by those who didn't want to be observed or followed. A person who didn't know the way could become lost in that dim warren in a matter of minutes. The streets themselves weren't much better, but I visited often enough to walk with confidence through those laneways. My grandmother's house had been standing for at least a century. It was built in the U-shaped Hafti and Hashti style around a central courtyard with a fountain sparkling in the sunshine and a wide balcony around the second level. It was still a home for the extended family on my mother's side. In generations past, the house would have been all bustle and gossip. It was still a busy place, but not as much as it had once been. My grandmother, I called her Nane, liked to spend her days on the balcony across from the central entrance gate. She saw who came, who went, who lingered, and who hurried on their way, all as she smoked hookah. I often went to visit my cousins. Nane would have no reason to think this time was any different. When we got there, I saw Vahid working on his motorcycle in the courtyard and waved to him. He set his tools aside and joined Reza, Nane, and me for tea and dried fruit on the balcony. I introduced Reza to Nane, and she quizzed me about how the family was and how I was doing in school. As soon as we could escape the interview, we went to Vahid's room, as we usually did. His room had a good view of the rest of the courtyard. If anyone was coming, we'd have time to make it look like we weren't up to anything other than hanging out together. Vahid took up his position by the cracked open door, and we put down a sheet of plastic and towels to protect Nane's carpets before we started. Reza made ink from burned elastic mixed with water, but I didn't really study what he was doing. I sat staring at my forearm, the pen poised over my skin, and I started to draw a similar image. I had been drawing a similar image for as long as I could remember, but this one was different. This one would be with me, always. I changed my grip on the pen, took a deep breath, and drew the image of the cross and book on my forearm. I wouldn't be able to keep it secret for long, but this was where it belonged. "You want to put it there?" Vahid asked. I didn't raise my eyes. "That's where I always put it. Besides, I want to be able to look down and see it wherever I want." Voices from the courtyard filtered in and blended with the music we were playing. Reza dipped a sewing needle into the homemade ink and poked it into my skin at the top of the cross. I clenched my jaw against the pain, but Reza didn't notice. All of his concentration focused on following the lines I'd drawn. It was a slow process, and Reza's uncertain skill meant that the needle often dug too deep. Blood dripped down my arm, my hand in warm trickles as he etched the raw lines into my flesh. Silence would have drawn attention, so we talked about Vahid's motorcycle, a topic that anyone who passed by would have heard us discuss at most times we were together. It was a poor distraction from the burning pain, but all I could do was grit my teeth and think of the result. It took the rest of the afternoon for the cross to become a permanent part of my body. When it was over, I stared at my swollen forearm. Pain throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I touched an angry-looking raw line, then pulled my finger back. What had I done? With my forearm oozing blood, the cross and book emblazoned across it. It was too late to change my mind. "You can't go around like that," Vahid said, looking at my arm. He left and came back with bandages. We cleaned things up as best we could and wrapped it so the fresh tattoo was hidden. What was I going to tell my family? I decided that I couldn't go home yet. I had to stay with Vahid's family, as I had so many times before. They probably noticed the bandage, but Vahid was a mechanic and was always getting hurt at work. Someone wearing a bandage likely didn't register anymore. They didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. A few days later, the swelling had come down. I wrapped an elastic bandage around my arm and went home. I hadn't been home for an hour when my mother noticed the bandage. "What did you do to your arm?" my mother asked. I could see that she was concerned. I just shrugged. I tried to walk away. "I hurt it at the gym." She followed me. "The gym? You've hurt your wrist or your elbow, but not the middle of your arm. What did you do?" "Nothing." I did my best to look innocent. If it was nothing, it wouldn't be bandaged. Let me see, or I'll tell your father." I didn't want either of them to know, not yet, but with her standing there looking at me like that, I didn't have a choice. I couldn't quite meet her eyes as I unwrapped the bandage. As soon as the tattoo came into view, her eyes widened. She reached toward the scabbed over lines and then pulled her hand back and covered her mouth instead. Shock and fear flashed through her eyes. "Your father will cut your arm off." She wasn't exaggerating by much. For as long as I could remember, my father's anger and violence had haunted our comfortable house. My brothers and sisters and I had all worn evidence of it, going to school with purple-black bruises he had inflicted with a short length of hose he kept for the purpose on a shelf in the corner of the living room with his keys and other things he liked to have within easy reach. We'd all done our best to shut our eyes to it and to cover our ears, to keep out the insults that created wounds deeper and more lasting than bruises. We'd all suffered the embarrassment of being dragged from a family gathering because his anger couldn't wait to be satisfied. We'd all seen how my mother's family, the only relatives we had in the city, looked down at him and pitied us because we were his children. I knew exactly what to expect. I couldn't rely on my mother to protect me from it either. If she tried, she would be beaten too. For the rest of the day, I waited, feeling the hours slip away toward evening. There would be no use in trying to convince my father it wasn't as bad as it looked, no use in apologizing. All I could do was wait. My arm was covered the whole time, but the rest of the family knew something was going on. The tension thickened as the sun went down. I was in the living room with my brothers and sisters when we heard the front door open with a thump. My mother met my father in the small entry. I couldn't hear what she said. I didn't really need to. I could hear the pressured anxiety in her voice. I stood and walked around the sofa, wanting to be ready. He came in, radiating rage, grabbed his piece of hose, and began to swing. Argument or explanation would do no good. I pulled my newly tattooed arm tight against my body to protect it until he decided I'd had enough. Pain exploded from the heavy blows, but I planted my feet and stood still. What's wrong with you? Not only do you get a tattoo, but you tattooed the cross? Who in our family is Christian? Your father's side or your mother's side? He shouted as he swung. The anger and exertion frayed the edges of the words. I stood there, my arm pulled against my chest, determined to stand still and take the beating while I tried to wall off the pain. My family stood around me, silent and watching. At last, my younger brother, Parsa, cried out. Tears streaked his face. It's only a drawing. He won't do it again. Please, stop. My father didn't stop. Parsa was 7. He probably didn't even know what a tattoo was. The longer it went on, the harder it was to be still. I raised my arm to protect myself. My father hesitated, then struck me again. I fended off that blow as well. His eyes were locked with mine, and he lowered his arm. Get in the car, he gestured toward the door with the hose. I didn't know what he had in mind, but his anger hadn't abated. I didn't dare disobey or ask questions. Fetid silence, heavy with the weight of unspoken insults, collected around us as he drove the familiar route to my grandmother's house. I had always been his favorite son, the one who made him most proud. Now I was the one who had disappointed him the most. When we got to Donna's house, he pulled me through the gate by my ear while demanding the key to her basement. I'm not sure what Nana thought was happening, but I could see the concern in her face as she gave him a brass key that looked like it belonged to another age. He unlocked the door and dragged me through 2 rooms where Nana stored food and other things the household needed. The 3rd room was rarely opened and held things that were too old or too broken to be useful, but couldn't be parted with. He shoved me inside and began to beat me again to drive me deeper into the dusty space. You'll stay here until you die, he said, stepped back and slammed the door shut. The scrape of the key in the lock made me shiver. The damp, deserted air around me settled into silence again. Moments later, cockroaches tapped and skittered as they emerged from their hiding place in the pile of broken furniture that crouched along one wall, or from the torn and dusty carpets piled next to the opposite wall. I was alone, abandoned. Pain throbbed through my arms and legs from injuries too numerous to count. The fresh tattoo hadn't escaped. The deep black bruise was already well formed, and my forearm was twice the size it should have been. I was afraid I had a blood clot, but I couldn't call out or try the door. If he was waiting, that would only make him angrier. I dragged one of the carpets out from the wall and lay down on it. The scent of raw earth floor filtered up through the dusty wool. Pain accompanied each heartbeat. I had been alone with the dust and the cockroaches long enough to lose track of the time when I heard the key in the lock again. I stood in tense, sore muscles, prepared for yet another beating. Instead of my father, it was Nana with a plate of bread and cheese and a red plastic jug of water. I sat down on the carpet. I wasn't going to be beaten, but she wouldn't risk my father's wrath to let me out. I stared up at her for a moment. Then I took the plate she offered. "Thanks," it was a surly mumble. Well, I couldn't let my grandson starve to death, no matter what he's done. I don't know how she found out, but I can guess that she called my mother as soon as my father had left her house. "Suppose you agree with him," I said. "What would you like me to say?" Donna asked. "You can't expect that I'd approve of what you did or the fact that you used my house to do it." I kept my eyes fixed on the plate of food. Figured you'd think what he did was all right. "Did I say that? You know what he's like. He can't sit with something that scares him. He has to lash out at it." I looked up at her. I don't think he looks scared to me." "Are you sure? He thinks about that," she pointed at my arm, "and all he sees are the things you've given up because you wanted to show what a man you were. Who's going to let you marry their daughter? Who's going to hire you? They'll see that, and they'll think that you've been to prison or that you're in a gang. The fact that it's a cross just makes it worse. He's afraid that you're rejecting everything, and if you do that, what will you have left? How long do you think it would take to get over that kind of fear?" I shrugged and pushed the food around on my plate. "Think about it and eat. I'm not feeding the roaches." She left me alone again. Several times a day, Nana brought me food and water and stayed with me while I ate. When she wasn't there, I stared at the lines I had etched into my skin. She was right about how I'd be perceived, but there was a certainty in knowing that whenever I looked down, I would see my drawing of the cross. I liked how that felt. Outside of the dusty space, life for the rest of the family in my grandmother's house went on as usual. People walked through the courtyard and along the balconies with either the intention of age or the blithe pace of youth. They laughed and gossiped, cooked and ate, slept and awakened to a new day. They knew I was there. If they hadn't witnessed my arrival, then they certainly had been told about it by someone else. None of them came to the door to see if I was still alive. I couldn't help but think that if it was one of my cousins who had been imprisoned in the basement, they wouldn't have been left alone and forgotten. The shadows were growing longer on the third day when the door opened again. I expected to see Nana in the doorway. My father stood there instead. "Go home," he said, and left me to find my own way there. It took me half an hour. Each time I passed someone, I tried to turn away and hide the vivid bruises. No one in my family said a word about where I had been. No one asked how I was, despite the evidence of violence painted across my skin. For weeks, I sat alone while my anger simmered and everyone else went about their lives as if I weren't there. This was the isolation of being alone in a crowd, and it was just as punishing as being alone with the insects. I had to heal before I could go back to the gym, and when I did, I would have to tell my coach about the tattoo. He would see it as soon as I started training. The first day I was able to go back, I found him in his cluttered office and unwrapped the bandage. He stood and looked from me to the cross and back again. It was as if I had suddenly become a stranger to him. "Are you stupid? You don't think?" he yelled, so much like my father had. "How do you expect to go into competition like that? And a cross? How are the gym directors going to explain to the officials that not only does one of their wrestlers have a tattoo, but he has a tattoo of the cross? Well?" I couldn't look at him. "Get out." He turned away from me and waved toward the door. "You're finished here." There was nothing left to say. I left. Everything was gone now. I was alone and adrift. In the eyes of my family, I was an outsider. What my grandmother had said was true. Tattoos were associated with gang members and people who had been to prison. Even though they knew I was neither of those, I was still looked upon with suspicion. I wasn't allowed to see Vahid anymore. I couldn't see my friends from the gym. I was ignored, alone. I spent hours in the park with pencils in my notebook. I still drew the cross in the same way that I had drawn it for the tattoo, but I also took Farsi words and sculpted them into broken hearts and other figures. I was still alone, but I was alone among strangers. Nearly 3 weeks later, the coach called me into a meeting. The directors wanted to replace you, but they thought the prospects of the team would suffer. He said, in training or competition, you keep it covered. I was glad to be wrestling again, but it wasn't the same. I'd wrapped my arm, but when it slipped, I could see the judgment on people's faces. I had been so close to my teammates, but now they wanted nothing to do with me outside of the gym. I spent time with other friends or by myself. I grew to value my independence because now I couldn't rely on anyone else. And that was the story of Joshua's first tattoo as he told it to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Have an opportunity now to ask a few questions, and then if there are other questions from those that are participating here on campus with us today. So I'm going to start out with those few questions. So the first question we had is, what is the most important thing to take away from this book?
So I think whoever you ask this question to, you're probably going to get a different answer. The book is, in some ways, it's a mirror of how people perceive the story. Some people may see it as a story of a refugee who escaped the terrible situation that he was in. Some may see it as a journal of faith. I think, personally, the most important message that can be taken away from this story is the idea of love and acceptance. Because nothing in that story could have happened without Joshua creating a community that was loving and accepting. And if we think of what that really means in today's world, we are separated. We like to think of ourselves as being separated. I am in this church, I am in this town, I am in this community. But if we're ever going to progress as people, if we are ever going to find a way to bring all of us together as one unit, then we have to have that love and acceptance. And it's not an easy thing. It truly isn't. But in one part of the story, Joshua goes into a homeless encampment to spread Christianity. He had seen homeless people, but he had never spent any significant time. It was a shocking experience. And the first time that he went, he had to leave. He couldn't even get close to this encampment because it was too much. And it took time for him to be able to say to himself, okay, I need to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do. And to build up that understanding and that acceptance, and to just sit and listen as if he were sitting and listening to anyone. And that's where the change started, not only for himself, but for the people that he was listening to. These were people who had been addicted to drugs for years, who were separated from their own families, who had so many struggles and so many heartaches and heartbreaks. It was only when he accepted them that they began to do better, that they wanted more, that they wanted to accept the help that he ultimately offered to better their lives in multiple ways. He went from meeting with people in an abandoned building to going to visit some of them in the businesses that they had started. So that love and acceptance is probably the biggest factor, I think, in life that we can do for each other. It is the biggest gift that we can give to each other. And that is across communities, across any kind of division that we think exists. Those are divisions that we've put in place in our minds. And we have to be able to find a way to move past them.
Very profound. We have a second question. Second question, what was the most difficult part of writing this book?
Okay, so this was not a book that I ever thought I'd write. So I'll just start there. I love to write my entire life. I have always written stories that were mostly like fantasy and fiction, fiction kind of stuff. I kind of thought that if I ever had a book published, it would be like some fluffy little piece of fiction that people buy at the airport and read on the beach. So this is kind of not that. And I am very proud of it, but it is very different. And so there are several things that I'll talk about. Well, one of them is the fact that I had to ask questions of someone that I would never, ever, ever ask of someone. For those people who have read it, you know that it delves into some very painful topics that I had no experience with. And I think that most Americans don't. We probably don't know someone who has been in those kinds of extreme situations. So in order to be able to write it in a way that brought people into the moment and into the story and gave them some kind of understanding, I had to ask some very personal and painful questions of someone who is very dear to me, and I didn't want to cause them any more pain. So that was very tough. And I think for some of them, I probably apologized after every single question that I asked because I'm not that, I don't do that. I don't ask those kinds of personal questions. So that was one thing. The other thing was that not only did I have to ask, I had to write it. And I'm getting a little emotional, I'm sorry, but that was hard to do. It was hard to watch this person that I care about so much not only say it, not only have to tell it again, but for me to actually have to put those words onto the page, because I could see it in my head. I could see it in my head, and I can still see it in my head when I look at those parts. And that was very painful. And I remember the day that I was sitting there writing about the time that he was arrested and basically disappeared from his life. And I had to keep saying to myself, he asked you to do this. You've got to do this. And so I would write a sentence or two and I would stop. And I would just say, okay, I need to step away for a second. And then I'd write another sentence or two and I'd stop. So that part, that was very difficult as well. And I know that he found it difficult to say. So, I mean, the toughest part about writing the book is that, it was trying for one person to relay such an extreme experience to another. That was very difficult. And he showed such courage doing it that I couldn't suddenly say, well, I can't do this. We've gotten halfway through, but I've decided I can't. That was never an option. If he had said, I don't think I can, I don't think I want to, I think I want to stop, that would have been fine. But I could not do that. I couldn't make that decision.
Thank you. And our third question, are there many Christians in Iran? If so, do they know each other, or do they have to stay separate to stay safe?
Okay, that's a really big question with a really big answer. Okay. There are probably more than you would expect. I'm not going to give numbers because I know that Joshua wouldn't want me to. He did help found one of the largest Christian groups in Iran today. So I'm gonna leave it at that, and your imaginations can take that the rest of the way. It is very dangerous for people to say that they are Christian, and it is very dangerous for them to meet and to worship. So no matter what faith we are in this country, we can say, you know, I am Christian, I am Jewish, I am Muslim, and it's fine. We can talk about it to our neighbors. You could tell someone at your table. You could invite them to your place of worship, and that's fine. You can put it out on Facebook and share all of that with no fear of being persecuted, of being arrested, of being jailed, of being killed. There it isn't like that at all. This is all a big secret. So in order to find other people who may want to convert, it is a very long process, and that's why Joshua started with the homeless, because that was actually the safest community that he could start and spread that word. Any other time, it's all false names, meeting in parks, meeting, you know, with just one or two other people for a long time until that person is vetted and until that new person is seen to really be, okay, they're really interested and they're not going to go and get us all arrested. Once that person is invited to a worship service, it is not a church like we would expect here. It is someone's home with maybe 12 people. That is the only way, by keeping those congregations very, very small, can they stay safe. So those little tiny groups meet. Sometimes they meet in the basement, because if they want to have music or anything that can be loud. And they're really a tight community, because they have to be. To bring any more than that together takes quite a lot of planning, quite a lot of logistics, quite a lot of, it is quite an operation. They have come together before in the past. So one of the things, and one of the first meetings is described in the book, everyone had a false name. They weren't allowed to give real names. They weren't allowed to talk about who else was in their congregation. They weren't allowed to talk about what they did for work. Anything, where they lived, anything that could be identifiable. Because even though they were only inviting people from those house churches, they didn't really know who was going to be in that group. The government could be there. They could have had spies in there. And gotten everyone arrested at that point. So there's that part of it. The other part is just getting a Bible in Iran. There is a version of the Bible that, from what I understand, is sold. It is not the Bible that anyone else would see or read. In order to get a Bible, it has to be smuggled in. And the cost to do that in money is huge. The cost in lives is bigger, because these are smuggled in by usually Kurdish men carrying on their backs these Bibles. The known pathways have landmines. So if the government finds out about a pathway where anything is coming in, not just Bibles, but other goods as well, they will plant landmines to kill people. If they find a pathway and just show up with border agents, they will kill everyone. Men, children, pack animals, everyone. that toll is huge, just to have a Bible, something, again, that we would all take for granted, to be able to have the text of our faith. They don't have that. So a lot of people will memorize, because that's how rarely they get to have this in their hands. Other people will have Xerox copies. To actually have a Bible, that's big. And then, if you have it, you have to protect it, because possession of a Bible is more, I don't want to say it's more criminal. The penalty is greater than possessing alcohol, which is also illegal. So just that possession of that one thing can send someone to prison. One word out of place can send someone to prison. Someone being captured can send that entire group that they worship with to prison if they were to tell those names. So it's difficult. I think they are together as much as they can be, and they certainly work together to do some amazing things. Christians in Iran right now still assist people to get out of homelessness, to get off of drugs, to rebuild their lives. They will distribute food parcels twice a year. So there are still these good works that are very, it's public that people can see that this is happening, but it's not like it's public where they can say, well, this was done by this was done by our church. So I think it's difficult. They do the best that they can. And I think they show great courage, because they know that they can lose everything at any given moment. They can lose their homes, their children, their lives, if they are found out, just for doing an act that we all in this country take for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, for sharing that. So we are getting short on time, so at this time, if there's anyone who did have any questions that they had from the author, we would be happy to gather those, and then we would be able to post those online at a later point. So we welcome that. We are going to be having the opportunity to have Dr. Robinson join us. He will be doing that via a web, because he isn't able to be here in person with us today. So I'm going to ask that they play that for us.
Hi, this is Steve Robinson, president of Lansing Community College, and I want to thank you for attending Becoming Joshua and the art exhibit Stories Untold. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this grand opening and reception and ribbon cutting for the Becoming Joshua art exhibit. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there in person. My son has a music competition in Kalamazoo that's taking place at this very time. Otherwise, I'd be there to support Joshua and his many friends as they've come together for this wonderful book ribbon cutting and art exhibit. I had the great privilege to sit down with Joshua and learn about his story face to face, look through his artwork, and have him on my radio show, Alumni Stories, where he told his story about his incredible journey from being imprisoned in Iran to being here in the United States, learning English and helping our students transform their lives. I'm very appreciative that you took some time to be here for the ribbon cutting. I want you to enjoy the moving visual art that you'll see today. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and everyone at LCC, I want to congratulate Joshua for the incredible creative output that he's shared with us as he takes his journey from the traumatic past to the lovely, wonderful, peaceful present that he's created for himself and for all of us. Have a wonderful event.
So I'd like to thank Tammy Vaughn again as our author. Appreciate you taking time today to share the story of Joshua and his first two lives. And thank you, Dr. Tanya Bailey, for being here. And very much thank you for all of you joining us here on campus, here at LCC in Lansing, Michigan, and those that are across Michigan, across the United States, and across the world. I would like to invite you now to join us over in the Technology and Learning Center building here at Lansing Community College. That is where we'll have the art exhibit grand opening. We'll have a ribbon cutting and reception. So thank you again, and thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, everyone.
I did want to share the TLC building where you'll be heading is across the courtyard from the Gannon building. You may stay here parked if you're parked in the ramp. There is also parking in the close to the University Center if you wanted to repark closer to that location. The author will also be there. We'll have books if you're interested in purchasing those. They're 30% of the proceeds will go towards LCC's Learning Commons, and also she'll be signing books while we're there. Okay, thank you.